thank you again for coming this evening. I am really excited about the opportunity to present sort of a wrap-up. I've been here for just about 14 months now and am getting ready to head back to the States to formalize my dissertation on Talchum. And so this is an exciting opportunity to start to work through a lot of the information that I've gathered. Talchum is such an enormous topic, and there are so many different elements to the mask dance here in Korea. So what I have to share with you this evening is just a sample, just a taste of the many, many opportunities and experiences that I have had over this last year. Archiving the Repertoire, the title comes from Diana Taylor's work, The Archive and the Repertoire. Diana Taylor is a performance studies professor and is from a Latin American country, but has spent the majority of her education and her career in the United States. And this book in particular talks about the difficulty or the tense negotiation at times between cultures who archive their histories and their stories in a narrative or performative mode, and the more Western imperialistic mode of writing, and how attempting in many relationships between cultures, writing has been favored over the performative, and more often than not the performative is lost, is not valued. And so in this work, she suggests, instead of strictly written documentation, she suggests using the scenario instead, which is one way of attempting to bring together the performed and the written in perpetuating or handing down a history. Because Talchum is performative, and it has been described to me as the archive, or one of the archives of Korean history, I have attempted to engage in a much more physical experience and a more narrative experience with Talchum, rather than a library-driven or strictly a go to a performance, take pictures and video and write about the experience. So I will attempt to share with you a wide variety of the physical and observation elements that I've experienced this year. This particular, also observations on the capture of the ephemeral. One of the conversations that I have come across quite frequently here in my research is the way in which Talchum is being preserved, and the concerns that some have that perhaps the Talchum that is preserved right now, the way that it is being preserved, is creating more of a museum piece than an actual continuation of the traditionally improvised stock characters. And so this reflects the often difficult attempts to capture the performative, which is ephemeral. It is not something, once you capture it, it becomes an archival piece that is frozen in time. So it becomes something different. This particular image, moving into more specifics about Talchum, I chose this image because it has a little bit of so many elements of Talchum. In the background, we have the drums, the central characters with the masks, the woman lying on the ground, the man behind her. Quite frequently, a character dies. In Talchum, usually it is an older woman who has been mistreated by her husband, but in this particular form, it is a young woman who was kidnapped by bandits, and her husband accuses her of infidelity with those bandits, and so when she is rescued, she then commits suicide because of the accusations of her husband. And it's a little difficult to see, I think, with the lighting the way it is, but to the left and right of the masked character in the center, there are otherworldly creatures who in this particular form of Talchum are represented by what looks like black shroud masks over their heads. Many of the 13 preserved forms of Talchum have creatures that are in some sense otherworldly, that are by degrees beneficial or bring punishment, particularly to the noblemen who are being satirized. And then another element of this picture you'll see to the right is a child who has been brought into the playing space to participate in the mourning ritual. When a character dies, there is also a funeral then, and often foreigners and children are brought into the playing space to participate as mourners in that ritual. As far as the location of Talchum, it happens in either a more traditional madang playing space, a large open area that is most frequently circular. This particular madang happens to be up in Yangju. Or more and more, there are Western-style stages that further separate the players on the stage. Often it's raised so that people in the audience can see better. There is a more distinct difference in this is the audience, this is the stage. One of the other concerns that I have come across is the distancing of the audience from the players. And that is an element that traditionally has been a critical element of Talchum. One of the defining elements of Talchum is the audience participation. And some of the concern is that once you separate the audience and the players, then there isn't the same, you're creating more of a Western style performance than preserving a historical form. As I read what precious little there is in English in the States, I got the impression that the audience participation was much more fluid than what I observed when I came here and saw my first few performances. With my theater background, the terminology that I was reading in the books gave me the impression that the entire performance, people were coming and going back and forth on the stage, that characters were trading masks with audience members who took on characters and participated as a character in the performance and then left and went back to their seat. And that is not the case. But it gave me the impression when I first saw this sequence, I immediately thought, wow, it's really true that Talchum has come a long way, and there's really this huge difference in the way it's being performed now. So this is a series of events where an older man who has clearly been imbibing, attempts to participate in the performance. And then I'll share with you just a little bit after this concludes about where I became a little confused. This scene that they are setting up for is the grandmother scene in Talchum. And the grandmother comes out, complains about how difficult her life has been, and collects money from the audience. Apparently, he felt that the loom had been set up incorrectly, so he was trying to fix it for the grandmother. Now, the grandmother has gotten up and started to ask for money from the audience, which has left the loom available. Go back to her loom, and he becomes a tad bit combative. They actually have to disassemble the loom from under him in order for them to actually finish the scene. That he's being videoed by the news, and then he really doesn't want to sit down. And the next scene actually had to wait until they had someone go and actually sit with the man off stage to make sure that he didn't come back to participate in further scenes. So from what I had read in the States, when I saw, this was the first Talchum performance that I had ever seen, because I had not been able to get a hold of any video or any other kind of archival material in the States. And so coming with what little I had been able to read and my own Western understanding of theater and audience participation, this struck me as a pretty significant difference between the audience participation that I thought was happening previously and the way that the performers interacted with the audience now. But one of the especially good things about the opportunity to be here in Korea and to view a very wide variety of performances is the clarification of just what the nuances of audience participation are with Talchum. The next 3 slides are examples of ways that the audience and performers interact. In this particular performance, there wasn't really a backstage. Performers, once they were done or had a bit of a break in their scenes, they would go sit in the audience. So you'd see audience, performer, audience. And just casually, as though they were actually a member of a modern audience. And then other characters in character would speak to these characters in the audience during the performance as well. In this performance and in others like it, the lion goes up into the audience and allows people to pet it and to talk to it. Some children have tried to ride it. Some people often try to climb under and become a part of the lion as well. And in this performance, this character in mid-sentence realized that someone near him was trying to take a picture, and so he stopped and posed. And once the person had taken the picture, thanked him, and he bowed and then continued on with his lines. Also, one of the important ways that the audience participates is through encouraging terminology to the performers as they go along. And it is so important that during rehearsals, when there is no audience in attendance, people who are not on stage take the role of the audience and call out and cheer and encourage the actors. So it's not simply a random yelling out to that if you're sitting in the audience and you hear people talking to the performers. That is actually considered a role in the performance, and it's not something that is simply added when the audience comes. It is something that is rehearsed in the rehearsal process as well. The masks are clearly a critical element of Talchum. There are 3 different kinds. One is the paper mask. This is an example of one form of paper mask. These were often burned at the end of a performance in a ceremonial way. Some traditions invited the masks they were sacred, and so they were believed to be possessed, and burning the mask freed the spirits to go back into the spirit world. I have a few examples. These are Kasan Ogwande masks that you're welcome to take a look at later on this evening. These are miniatures. This is a set of 5 characters that at the beginning of this particular performance, each of these 5 are eaten by a monster that eats Yangman. Then there are the wooden masks. Hawaii masks are the best known wooden masks. There are some other wooden masks, but the Hawaii masks are all carved out of wood. The wooden masks were not burned afterward. They were considered sacred, but they were then enshrined after the performance. They were not carved for each performance. And then masks made out of gourd and other natural substances. Fur, bark, other types of items found in nature. The masks are frequently symbolic and and communicate to the audience. As soon as an audience sees a mask, they know the character, that both the name of the character, the personage, and also the inner character, how that character behaves, how they are known in the masked community. This particular mask is from Hongsan Talchum, and I'm told that the ridges, the wrinkles in his forehead indicate, because they are more of a normal human shape, that this monk is one that is considered normal, respectable. Whereas this monk has an excessive number of wrinkles. So elements in a mask that are excessive show character flaws. And then there are several masks in a variety of forms that are covered in fur or use a generous amount of fur. And for Yangban in particular, this is often believed to show that they are so bad, that they're not even human, or they're more animal than human. They also show the character's station in life. These next 3 slides are a series of female masks. This one has no mouth opening. She never speaks, which is, I'm told that a new bride historically was told for the first 3 years of her marriage not to only observe and not to speak. If you look carefully, I'm not sure that you can really tell from this picture, but when you look at the actual mask, the one eye is pointing down and one eye is looking up, which goes along with what the bride was told. Only notice half of what you actually see. Turn a blind eye to many other things. The barmaid, Bune, she has a small mouth opening. She is able to support herself. She has her own business. And when the monk attempts to seduce her, she is able to hold him off for a certain amount of time. She is able to say no up to a point. And then there's Halmi, the grandmother, who has a wide mouth opening. She can say pretty much whatever she wants. She's had a miserable existence. Her husband died 3 days after they were married, and she lived the rest of her life as a widow in her in-laws' home. She wears rags. She begs from the audience. Her right eye is disfigured. You can probably see that in the image, which I'm told has been disfigured by all of the tears that she has shed over her difficult lifetime. The masks have physical movement that accompany them. With the forms that have the larger masks, there are also larger arm and body movements, so that the mask doesn't, or that the body matches the size of the mask and doesn't get lost in the performance. This particular segment here is of Hongsan Talchum. And then in comparison, the small mask, such as the Hawaii Talchum masks that are almost exactly the shape of, or the size of a human face versus much larger. Hawaii has much smaller, more everyday representative movements. And then Hawaii is noted for the articulated jaw. There are a couple of other forms that have a mask or two that have the articulated jaw, but the majority of the Hawaii masks have, as they were carved, the jaw is cut away from the mask and then tied back onto the mask so that it will move with the performer. The masks that I have up here in the corners actually have a string tied to the mask, and then the performer puts the string in their mouth, and that is how the jaw and the mask move together. However, there are some that just simply, they sit so close to the face. The mask, when I trained in Hawaii earlier this year, the mask actually rested so close on my face that as I spoke, the jaw moved with me. So there are, depending on which mask, who carved it, there's a little bit of variation in how the mask actually moves. But this is an example. It's a little blurry. I apologize. I hope no one gets seasick. But focus on the mask. As I was videoing this, I was jostled several times. The camera moved. So try just to focus on the jaw. So that particular mask, there's no string. He's not manipulating it through a string held in his mouth. It's moving with him. Talchum is divided, or can be divided, into three regions. Characteristics of the northern, central, and southern regions are slightly different. The storylines are often very similar. The characters are similar in many ways. But in the north, many of the forms have very large movements that are thought to be perhaps elements of self-defense, because the north saw much more invasion activity than further in the southern regions. Also, the north is a bit colder, and so it is thought that a lot of these large jumping movements were also designed to help keep people warm as they were participating in the dance. This is Unyo Talchum, and one of the large movements. And then the central region is known more for its earthbound connectedness. It's more of an agricultural area, and so this next clip is actually, as I was training in it, they told me that I was to stand with 1 foot standing on the ground and 1 foot standing on the air. So there's where I perhaps would have described it as holding 1 foot in the air, suspended. It's seen more as a relational. The air is an element that is actually used for support, as opposed to the individual attempting to hold the leg independently. There's not so much jumping, leaving the ground. There's always 1 foot or 1 hand that is connected with the ground. Again, my camera got bumped a couple of times, so I apologize. And then in the south, where there are many areas that come in direct contact with the ocean, many of the forms are much more flowy. There are still some jumps, but the motion is very much moves like the water, the waves, and the motion of the most part, the performances that I saw this year and that I trained in as well were the preserved and what is considered accurate versions of Talchum. There were two notable exceptions, maybe not exceptions, maybe additions is a better way to describe it. At the Dano Festival earlier this spring, there were 3 performances of the same storyline. The first 2 were variations on the third, the preserved Talchum form. This first one here at the top was a very playful version of the same storyline that was presented later in the afternoon. The Guande I'll talk about in just a minute. But this playful version kept to the same storyline, but they added several elements such as the rings that formed the person in that previous picture. They also built this large shroud-like object in the back. That served as their backstage. It also moved. The entire cast was inside of that object. This enormous version of the otherworldly character. And they actually manipulated this other character. And before they got into the actual storyline, they embellished it a little bit with these PVC pipes. And they used them throughout the performance as well as framing objects, as obstacles for the characters that they had to attempt to overcome as they were telling the story. And then they had a generous number of puppets that they used in several different ways. This is the couple meeting, falling in love. And now they're about to be attacked by bandits. That particular character is wearing the mask on the back of his head, and then he dances backwards for the rest of that scene. Now this is where the young woman has been accused of infidelity. She goes up to the top of a cliff and jumps in order to kill herself. The puppet is in the background while the woman, the performer, can't actually ascend a cliff and jump. The puppet actually does. So then later on, the large puppet-like object in the background then also becomes part of the funeral ceremony, and people from the audience come up and pin their wishes and hopes to the background as part of the mourning process for the young woman. In contrast to this group that embellished or modernized the traditional storyline, the Gwangdae many of them are performers within the Kusan Ogwangdae tradition. They have also improvised and developed a few other scripts. So this particular script is masked and is performed by performers from the historical and preserved tradition, but it is a completely different storyline. It is not one that is included as a new piece in the Ogwangdae repertoire at all, but it is something that is being done in addition to lost my cursor now. Okay, here we go. This particular piece satirizes plastic surgery. So he talks this young woman into having a series of surgeries where the performer goes to the background, makes modifications to the mask, comes back, much to the excitement and encouragement of the young man. It is still not enough, all of the changes that the young woman has made to her face, so she has further surgery done until she actually becomes a different person. So the young man now accepts her, but before long they realize and now they look just like everyone else. And after a comedy of errors-like series of events, they end up unmasking and becoming themselves. I have quite a few of the actual masks or artist versions of the masks here, but I'm pushing it for time. So I am happy to stay after the question and answer time and talk to anyone who has questions or is interested in some of the specifics of the masks and the characters that I have placed around the room. But we should probably move to some questions if you have any.
I'm wondering about the bare midriff. Is that a new thing?
Not really new. The character that usually has the bare midriff is the older grandmother character who is, I'm told that is an indication of a poor character and that she is dressed in rags. So with this particular performance, I suspect it may be more about some of the fashion elements, but yeah, I don't know that for sure. That's just a speculation on my part, but
it sure looks like it.
yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, when you were describing earlier that the performances were divided into 3 geographic regions, northern, central, and southern, what was the limit on the north? Is that still traditional South Korea, or is that north inclusive of North Korea? And if so, how far north? Are the performances traditional all the way to the Russian border and further, or what?
It has depended on the people that I have talked with. I spoke with one person who puts the border all the way well into China. Others have placed the border more where it is currently. But the northern forms actually are believed to have been what is now North Korea, not between Seoul and the DMZ. They are being preserved here in Seoul and between Seoul and the DMZ, but most of them are historically considered from what is now North Korea.
Do we know anything about what's going on with Talchum in North Korea?
We don't know very much. I have not been able to find anything official. I have met a person or two who were born and raised in North Korea and have mentioned that they did see Talchum and that the annual performance of Talchum was quite popular, but I haven't seen any pictures, haven't heard anything that would be considered official or, but I did find that conversation very interesting.
Thanks, JL. It's great to see how much your research has progressed over the year. I have one question. To what extent does this theoretical frame of archiving the ephemeral or archiving the performative, how much will that play into your dissertation? Because I kind of take that to be more of kind of a sensory ethnography type viewpoint, or certainly an interpretive one. And I know that you visited, 11 out of the 13 different Talchum forms. And so were you able to talk to a lot of the performers to kind of get their interpretations and their own ideas on the performative?
The language barrier has been significant. And I have been fortunate enough to have an interpreter with me at many of the performances that I have been to, but not all of them. And so there have been a handful of the forms where I have been able to talk with performers, train with instructors, and get more specific firsthand information from those individuals. But that experience has not been across the board. That is part of why the physical experience, I'm very hesitant to talk about Talchum in a definitive way because there has been an enormous amount that has been written and cataloged in Korean that I just don't have access to at this point with my language ability, with the resources that I have for enlisting the aid of a translator for the books that have been written and other performances that have been taken here in Korea. So the theoretical framework then will help me to make observations, and it will also help me avoid sounding like, because I spent a year in Korea, I know exactly what is going on with all elements of Talchum, because that's just not the case. I may have more experience, more direct experience with Talchum than the vast number of Americans or academics in the States, but there is still a lot more for me to learn as my language progresses and as I'm able to come back and spend time in a library and interacting more on a comfort level, speaking with people in Korean. So that's why I have chosen to try to use that theoretical framework to help position my research in a way that it can grow with me as I continue to ask questions and learn more about what is happening with Talchum here in Korea. Yes?
Have you been approached in the course of your work here by any cultural anthropologist trying to look for some way to find cultural DNA embedded in this art form? Tell tales about Korean character or Korean sense of itself, something like that. I know you are not an anthropologist, but anthropologists love to do that. And they, for that reason, often annoy people who are not interested. I was just wondering if you might have been approached by anybody.
I have not, actually, and I'm a tad bit disappointed because I was sort of interested in engaging in that conversation. But with the stock characters, it seems that perhaps would be something that would appeal to someone who is looking at that perspective. Although many people feel that there's a pretty significant divide between the stock characters that are Talchum and modern personalities and the way people live their lives today.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. Since you attended several performances, I'm curious to know about the age demographics of the audience and especially whether there were young members of the audience who seemed to have a genuine interest in it.
The audience was always a fascination for me. There were pretty much without exception a wide range of ages and genders. Often, depending on where I was, there were also a fair number of foreigners as well. Andong, with the Mask Festival, had a large number of foreigners. Not so much Westerners, but throughout Asia, that attracts a large number of foreigners. But then in several of the performances here in Seoul, there were a pleasantly surprising number of Westerners at those performances as well. And the performances where in many Western theater traditions, you sit politely in your assigned seat and you get up at the intermission. Here, and particularly at the longer, I attended a number of abbreviated performances. They tend to be an hour long each, but each tradition each year has at least one performance where they do the entire repertoire, which can be anywhere between 3 and 5 hours. And so everyone is quite relaxed, and people come and go as they please, and the performance happens in its own time. And often people walk right across the madang, and occasionally performers have tripped over them, or frequently I had people coming up to my camera and peering inside, or attempting to maneuver to see just how it worked. At one performance there was about a two-year-old who didn't want to go home, and so latched onto my tripod and was trying to use that as an anchor while his parent was trying to pull him away. And so there was all kinds of drama happening off of the stage as well. People would get into arguments because they'd been drinking too much, or at one performance there was an older woman who sat squarely on my feet, and a little boy about 5 years old laid across my back and put his head on my shoulder, neither of whom I had met before. So it's still very communal. Actually, I was kind of honored that I was accepted to that point in that particular performance. So it's very much a family affair. People bring their children, even though it's a very earthy form. There are lots of the masks are frequently have phallic references. There are lots of this isn't very academic, but lots of fart jokes, and there are several times that people represent the sexual act in several different ways, and kids, parents bring their kids and laugh along and call and jeer, and everyone from the little kids all the way up through the grandparents. So it still remains very much a community event.
So you mentioned that there's stock characters and consistent storylines, but within each individual performance, how scripted is it, and how much does that vary? Is it performance specific, or how much room do they have this?
It's a little difficult for me to be able to answer that completely. Each form does have a scripted element to it, and people that train in the form are taught the script. But within the dance movements and the words themselves, the performer has the opportunity to improvise a little bit. And so there are some forms that will throw in current politics and popular performers and other elements that people today know. I was at one performance where the monster character was attempting to eat the yangban, and the yangban fought back hard enough that it knocked off the microphone of the monster, who then, frustrated, had to stop the performance. You knocked my mic off, and included that element within the actual performance. Since I wasn't able to fully understand what was happening verbally, it's a little difficult to say just how pervasive that is. Some of the 13 forms are much more improvised. They have less of a scripted structure, and it's a little more like Commedia, where you've got these two characters who are in conflict and they just sort of run with it. And then others are much more particular about saying these words at this time, and you can vary it a little bit in the gestures and the dance of the character, but you have to say these words. So it sort of runs the spectrum as far as that goes. Do we have time for one more?
Where does the word come from?
I'm sorry, where does the term Talchum?
Term, yeah.
Okay, Tal in Korean is mask, and Chum is dance. So mask, dance. Yeah. Chum is actually, there are several political nuances within the choice and use of the word, of that chum, as opposed to other words that mean the same thing, that have different origins.
I'm interested in your questions surrounding like the performative and the ephemeral, actually codify it. And can you describe a little bit of how you're actually like physically learning the dances has informed your own research and how you plan to take it back and through your dissertation work and also just through describing these traditions?
It has been an interesting process for me to train in the different forms. I have had varying degrees of training depending on the time, the finances, the availability of a translator. Some of the training has strictly been physical because I have gotten to a point where we can't really understand very much more of what we're saying to each other. So it's strictly mimicking what is happening. But then there have been other times where I've had translators with me, and it's been a wonderful experience to hear the stories that go along with the training, and also the way in which the training occurs, such as what I said earlier, where in Yangju, where that sequence that I showed has the one knee. To me, one knee is in the air, and you're holding your foot up that whole time. And even though you're moving in a gesture that suggests a jump, you don't put your foot down, and you get really tired, and you have to build up a lot of stamina in order to do that. But the discussion of yourself being in relationship to the air is something that was fairly new to me. I had a little bit of modern dance training, and there was some discussion about disturbing and pushing and moving the air, but not so much the relationship between your body and using or having the air support you. And then other metaphors and ways in which the instructors train, and was very helpful in grasping things that as a Westerner I would not have otherwise understood or even come into contact with. And so in that way, I feel like my writing and the way that I talk about videos or other movements that I share in a lecture or in a more informal classroom setting are perhaps better informed than if I had simply stayed in the States and read what little there is, or even if I had come and strictly sat in the audience and used a camera or a video recorder. It helped me to overcome some of the perceptual barriers that I had no way of realizing from my experience that I held. So I think that as I write the dissertation and as I go forward, hopefully into a teaching career, that will help in presenting a better rounded, a better representation of Korea and Talchum than simply, this is my Westerner observation of, this is what's happening. I can tell you because I was there, kind of thing. It has helped me, even though theoretically I knew that there was a whole lot more out there and happening than what I realized. It helped give me an idea of what some of those things were. As far as the dissertation, I'm told that there's this great new electronic submission where I can include actual pieces of the video. I need to get trained on that when I go back to the States, and that's something that I also have to get approval of by my committee, because that would be a much less traditional dissertation experience. But I'm hoping to be able to include, since I am trying to work more with the scenario, the wider range of experiences than simply writing. I'm really hoping that that'll be something that I'll be allowed to.
Thank you very much.